1983. 1 year ago tonight, as we usually begin our program by updating the news, there were several items in the news. One, Roberto Calvi's widow was accusing the Vatican of working with the Opus Dei. That's that very conservative business organization that controls the major wealth of most of the Catholics around the world. And it's a secret society and a somewhat dangerous society. And she accused the Opus Dei of taking over the Vatican debts. They had a $1.2 billion missing money. That's several hundred million. And the worst part was the dummy fronts down in Panama and not explaining where it was going, and then later linked to organized crime and gun running and so forth out of Milan. Well, she accused the Opus Dei of taking over the Vatican debts, and she said the Pope shouldn't be involved as a money changer, and you should remove the money changers from the temple. And just this last week, there was an article about Roberto Calvi's widow. This was sent to me by Ted Rubenstein from the Chicago Tribune. It's November 30th, 1983. Scandal figure flees for life, from Reuters. The widow of Italian banker Roberto Calvi has fled to Britain in fear of her life after giving Italian magistrates new evidence implicating the Vatican officials in her husband's death. I think the Vatican was implicated in the Pope before this one and some other deaths too. She says the Vatican is implicated specifically in her husband's death, and she gave them information. The newspaper quoted Clara Calvi as saying the evidence proved her husband, who was known as God's banker for his links with the Vatican, was murdered to keep him quiet. He was murdered in London, and she's fleeing to London. I don't know why she thinks that's safe. The article says a 62-year-old head of Banco Ambrosiano in Milan, that's in the same building where the drug running and narcotics headquarters were, with siphoning these various guns and weapons around the world and drugs. Her husband was found hanging in Great Britain. That was in June 1982. At first they said it was a suicide. Then they had a second inquest and called his death a mystery. The new evidence implicates senior Vatican officials, Italian politicians, and leading members of the P2 Freemason Society. That's Licio Gelli and Ronald Reagan's friend, who was at his inauguration, who's now hiding in Argentina. She said, my life is in danger. That's why she's come to England. She's not safe in Italy anymore. She came across the documents while checking her late husband's effects in a strong box that was kept in the Bahamas. The information is very important, explosive, I think. So Mrs. Calvi, 1 year later, is saying the Vatican had a role in killing her husband, and she's talking about it. I talked about the story of the Tylenol murders. It was about to break. A Chicago stockbroker who's still not named publicly, a dummy front in Chicago, an import-export business, and Mr. Lewis, a tax consultant. There's somebody in Chicago very high up and well-known who's involved with the Tylenol murders and the Tylenol scandals, which I believe and know is an international thing, going to Southeast Asia and India with Mr. Lewis's offices. He's been charged with writing an extortion note, but he hasn't been charged with any of the murders, even though he was once charged with murdering a friend of the family, and he got off of that one. That's still wide open and it hasn't been solved. Colin Chapman had just been murdered, 54 years old. The designer of racing cars died in England, founder of the Lotus Car Company. He was part of the development of DeLorean cars. Right after John DeLorean was arrested, Colin Chapman died, and they were involved with the Panamanian company, the funds paid by Panama for the Panamanian banks into Swiss banks. And with Mr. Chapman dead, Colin Chapman dead, they've been looking for a year for the money that went from Panama into the Swiss banks that he helped John DeLorean with designing the car. He was killed, and a whole year later there's still a mystery there. And I'm sure that the reason he had to die was because he would know the answers to some of those questions they're not ready for. Also, the anti-terrorism plan for the LA Olympics, the big discussion of the Delta Blue Light team is poised in readiness, sent from Fort Bragg, North Carolina, with Mr. Colonel Charles Beckwith in charge. He's the fellow that made such a disaster out of the Iranian crisis. And there was an article of Mr. Beckwith in the paper just this last Sunday, yesterday, saying that his suggestion for hostages to kill them all, that he'd shoot them on the spot and kill them all. That's the way he would do it if they have a hostage crisis at the Olympics in Los Angeles. If they want money, give an airplane, and when it goes up, blow them up. Well, the CIA and the Los Angeles Police Department and the COINTEL program and the Defense Department could have a coup whereby we lose all our freedoms, and they can kill the hostage on the spot that caused the martial law, and then kill him, and then we won't ever know the true story of how we are losing our freedoms. The same way that you hired Jack Ruby, a few days or a week ahead, and he's to have a contract to kill somebody on a certain day, like Sunday, and then he panics when he realizes it's part of the Kennedy assassination. The story of killing them on the spot is very treacherous. Ed Davis, when he was chief of police, he's now a senator in California, wanted a guillotine, or Evel Younger wanted a gallows with a rope hanging, not a guillotine, the rope at the airport. If there's a hijacker, you hang him right on the spot. Well, the hijacking brought a series of searches and invasions of privacy. Suspect that we're going to take planes off in every airport, so that you can't get to a plane without going through this all of the time and being held up and going through bags. And a good percentage of the hostages were provocateurs at the time, but it brought the new laws so that there's a stumbling block to your freedom everywhere you go along the line. Also last year, The Belarus Secret came out by John Loftus, and I talked about it at length. That is one of the best books of the year, along with Trading with the Enemy by Charles Hyam. And in there he talks about Frank Wiesner of the OSS, who was director of the Office of Policy Coordination, who brought in the Nazis from the Iron Guard and the Romanians and so forth. And I learned just this year that Mr. Liebler, Wesley Liebler, who was an attorney for the Warren Commission, worked in the law office of Frank Wiesner in New York City, and Liebler was in charge of the testimony of the White Russian czarists, the friends of Lee and Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. That was his expertise, and he came out of the law office of Frank Wiesner. I think Peter Del Scott has this book in his book on the Kennedy assassination. And he also tells in the book how General Patton was sheltering a large number of the SS members with him. That was also Fritz Kramer was on that staff, and Otto Skorzeny and their special units that were to be used later. Now, there's more on these Nazis that assembled together that came out in the London Times this last week and also yesterday, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But a year ago, these items were in the news, how the special forces I talked about was formed by Hitler's agents, Dr. Franz Alfred Sieks, and how our Green Berets and our Mr. Beckwith got their muscles from Hitler's Nazis and from Otto Skorzeny, who formed those special forces. And now they want to come in quotes, to save us. They will create the situation, then they'll come in and save us. The excuse for killing the terrorists on spot, Beckwith said this week, has to do with, look at what happened at the Munich Olympic Games in 1972 with the hooded Palestinian terrorists and the 11 Israeli Olympic athletes that were killed. Well, it's been a few years since 1972, 11 years, and everyone involved with their George Habash from Lebanon, with his links to Larry McDonald, the CIA, the links to Richard Nixon. The CIA was heavily involved with the Nazis and the Palestinians that created the crisis. And he says in his article that since that horror, we've watched and worried about the Olympics coming to Los Angeles. And he tells how in Munich, the Germans couldn't act. They could see the counter-terrorists through their scope, but they didn't shoot them. They had their sights ready, but they lacked the resolve, and they didn't fire. And you could watch on television for the first time this hostage rescue team, this wonderful phenomena. Well, that was duplicated 2 years later by the Los Angeles Police Department and the SWAT team. If you like to see that kind of action, then follow it up, because what you get is the first story, and what follows later is the actual terrible story of how the CIA and the Nazis, Otto Skorzeny and Hitler's Nazis in Palestine and in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Washington, set up the controversy, then have the excuse to save you from the problem. Now, at first, I was going to do the entire broadcast tonight on the new information on Hitler's diaries that was in the Sunday London Times on December the 11th. I did broadcast on that, 3 broadcasts last May, and left it wide open. I felt that the continuity of the top Nazis who appeared in the story of the Hitler's Diary was so important. So yesterday I spent about 12 hours outlining that and decided next week I would probably do the entire hour on it. The article was written by a woman, Gita Sereni, and she went to visit East Germany, United States, and spent the past 7 months looking up and meeting the people involved in this story. But just to tell you how tangled it is, the first Nazi story on the Nazi Diary not only brought together Mr. Gert Heidemann, the fellow who had Göring's yacht, where he entertained Mr. Wilhelm Mohnke, M-O-H-N-K-E, the head of the Death's Head, the special group that provided a continuity of the Waffen-SS after the war for Adolf Hitler. He had Mr. Karl Wolff, who I wrote about in the Rebel article, and we'll do more about that. And he's friends with Wolff, and Wolff went down with Mr. Heidemann down to South America, and they saw Walter Rauff, and they were to see Mr. Bormann, Martin Bormann. And this news story has a more complicated interpretation. A man is in jail by the name of Mr. Kujau. His other name, Konrad Kujau, K-O-J-A-U. And he says that he wrote the diaries. He's in the jail because he wrote the diaries, but 3 years before he said he wrote them, they were in the United States in the hands of other people. And he's lying, but he's willing to stay there, and he won't tell who really did it. Now, the diaries were thrown out as not being real. About 20 were examined out of 60 diaries because the paper was used and manufactured in the 50s, the ink and paper. And they said, therefore, the diaries, even though they were authenticated by the Germans and top people like you, Trevor Roper, of British intelligence, as being real, the catchline was they can't be real because the paper and ink came later. They could be real if Hitler were alive, and there's a lot of unanswered questions. The wave that we're getting on Hitler's diary brings in his driver, Erich Kemke, K-E-M-P-K-A, who's the head of an organization called HIAG, so it sounds like Alexander Haig, and he was a member of the Waffen-SS, the elite group to protect Adolf Hitler. Hitler's driver is involved in this story, and he's funded with money from a businessman living in the area in Europe who gives money to the organization, who wants to buy the yacht and allegedly brings Heidemann in for that purpose. Hitler's pilot, Jan Brauer, is involved in this story. He meets with the SS. Currently, there is a birthday party for him, J-A-N-S-B-R-A-U-E-R. Wilhelm Mohnke, Hitler's chief of the SS, works and socializes with the Hague, that same organization of the Waffen-SS now, and with Karl Wolff and Mr. Heidemann. He's in here, and also Karl Wolff, written up in Operation Sunrise, and the story of the meeting of minds of Alan Dulles and Wolff, who was the liaison of Himmler to the Americans and was in charge of Treblinka and the concentration camps. He was killing masses while he was meeting with Americans in Switzerland. Walter Rauff lives in Chile, and Wolff and Heidemann went down to see him. Martin Bormann is down in South America, although in this London Times they say that he was in Spain and wanted to see Mr. Heidemann, that he was in Spain. There's another man, Wolfgang Schulze, S-C-H-U-L-Z-E, from Stuttgart, an attorney living in Florida. And Otto Skorzeny, of course, was a kingpin who traveled around meeting the Waffen-SS. There's another man, his name is Mr. Klapper, K-L-A-P-P-E-R, one of the highest Nazis of the SS, who is head of the Liebstandarte, L-I-B-E-B-S-T-A-N-D-A-R-T-E. Lieb, L-I-E-B, Stand, S-T-A-N-D-A-R-D-T. And that's part of that Haig group to maintain the Waffen-SS for 1,000 years. He's part of this, and a Fritz Stiefel, who's funding Kemke, Hitler's driver, and then another dangerous man, Jacob Tiefenthaler, who's part of the whole group, Tiefenthaler, T-I-E-F-E-N-T-H-A-L-R, and he has extensive contacts with former Nazis, and keeps his membership up in this organization, this Haig, H-I-A-G, again, it's not the H-I-G, working with Hitler's driver, with Hitler's pilot, but he also is in the United States Army in Germany working as Chief of Audio-Visual Instruction. Now, the only one missing out of this gang who worked at the Battle of the Bulge and worked terminating the war and on Patton's staff was Fritz Kramer. Now, can you believe that Hitler's driver, Mr. Kempke, Hitler's yacht is in Florida, Hitler's pilot's involved, the head of the Death's Head Monkey who was at the Battle of the Bulge in the battle with Fritz Kramer and then ends to close up the bunker for Hitler, Karl Wolff, Mr. Ralph, they're all together. Martin Bormann, Wolfgang Schultz, Otto Skorzeny went on to work for the CIA and Galen at the same time. Klaus Barbie, they visited down in South America. Mr. Mengeles, Joseph Mengeles is in Paraguay. Mr. Clapper of the Lebensdorf, Fritz Stiefel funding the Hague organization and wanting to buy the Goering yacht, and Jacob Tiefenthaler, to tap it off, who is employed, funding the group, working with them, employed Chief of Audio Visual of the U.S. Army. That's quite a team, and it will take me 1 hour to break that down. I spent 10 hours outlining that article. So I think that we'll do more on that the entire week next week, or maybe this week after. One piece of good news before we go on to some of the other news that I think is unsettling. There was an election in Japan, and Mr. Nakasone didn't do very well. There was a setback, so maybe the voting machines aren't all rigged after all. Now, I thought that one of the 36 motives for the 007 going down was the hoping that the anti-Soviet feeling would promote Mr. Nakasone just at the time of his election that was coming up, because he wants more arms, more weapons for Japan. Japan doesn't want to spend the money we want them to put in. They don't want to arm to the hilt. There has to be a reason so they could say, well, look at the vicious Russians. We have to arm, and here's Nakasone. He wouldn't appease it, sort of like the Ronald Reagan of Japan. And Nakasone was a Harvard student under Henry Kissinger. He's part of the Kissinger-Harvard crowd, and the president made this wonderful trip to see Nakasone to help campaign for him just prior to the elections. The aura of America. Maybe they think America's messed up and they don't want any part of it. Maybe at this point they voted against him because Reagan was there. Maybe Reagan thought he was funny. But as soon as the Korean airline went down, it escalated his star. And remember, it was the Japanese I quoted last week on the air who said that they traced the exact moment and hour that the plane dropped, but they didn't warn them that they were out of their area by several hundred miles. They just amazingly had contact with them, but couldn't remember or hear or warn them that their radar was off. 3 of the best pilots. So Japan and the United States intelligence had a role in letting this plane go into the wild wind and into the ocean. And it was used quite a bit for Japan at the time the plane went down, and tapping it off with the president going there just prior to the election. Well, in Spain, when they elected the new head of the government, this was almost a year ago, the Pope was going there to visit and campaign for his opponent, and they were taking down the political posters and things, so it would be nice for the right wing, the very conservative group, to see the Pope coming in with the aura of the church because they're all Catholic. Well, it didn't wash there, and they didn't vote. They said the Pope can't come till after the elections, and that's the way the president should be. He should stay away, and maybe his trip was in vain, and that's okay. Next week also, I'm going to update an article, an interesting article from the Washington Post on Western goals and Larry McDonald, and it's called Death Unsettles the Board of the Anti-Communist Unit. And the reason I bring it up now, just to touch on it, tell you it's out there, is that I mentioned last week how Mr. Lefevre, Ernest Lefevre, had a eulogy for Larry McDonald in the D.C. Times, Reverend Moon's paper, about 12 hours after the plane went down, that was so complicated and so anti-communist that I put it on the air. And I said that Lefevre is on the board of the organization that for strategic trade with Daniel Graham and the retired Fritz Kramer. Our American one isn't supposed to be a general. The Nazi is. But Fritz Kramer and Daniel Graham have their offices in Washington, and Lefevre is on the board. And Daniel Graham works directly with and they were with Admiral Moore and with John Reese of Western Goals. And if anybody wanted to unload Larry McDonald and blame the communists and have a power takeover of the computers, and also because of the scandal with the Los Angeles Police Department, I said last week and hinted that they would have foreknowledge. Somebody had foreknowledge. So now there's a vicious fight between a retired General Lewis Walt of Orlando, Florida, who commanded the Marines in Vietnam, and the military. There's a faction here fighting each other, which indicates it was not all peach and roses, and they could have dumped Larry into the ocean and taken over the monster or the control that was in the hands of the Birch Society and escalated even farther right and erased the chance of exposing the scandals in Los Angeles. There's an article in the paper just today, Global Problems Seem to Spur Draft Sign-Up, and it says, the shooting of the Korean airliner by the Soviet Union, the bombing of the Marines in Lebanon, and the invasion of Grenada have coincided with a sharp increase in draft registration. Now, I tried to make the point last week, and it's very important, that these are provocateur operations, and that we create the situation that we say, now join the army, because look at all the enemies. The Lebanese bomb us. We had plenty of warning. We knew it. We were warned of the security. The Grenada story we cooked up, it took us from 1979 to 1983 to make it safe for the mafia and Robert Vesco again. But synchronizing them together, and that's why I stressed the point last week, the bunching of them together, the 007, the Burma explosions, the Lebanon, and the Grenada. Oh boy, the 17, 18-year-olds will think their country's fallen apart, and barricades in Washington. So the article says because the 007, the Lebanon, and the Grenada, and that's exactly the effect they want. Come sign up and defend your country, and we'll watch some more coffins come home with flags, and these fools run off and don't even question the other news that indicates that all of these things were provocations that were well planned. Now, there's one short thing I want to mention. It's an article in the Dallas Times-Herald by Molly Ivins, I-V-I-N-S, about Charles Spears. And I hate the word theorist. She says, not your average conspiracy theorist. And she says that she's on Charlie's mailing list. And he transcribes these tapes and sends them to various people around the country and news media people. And she said one wonderful thing about Charlie Spears is that he believes in a whole lot of conspiracies. He's not just stuck on the Trilateral Commission or the Council of Foreign Relations. Now, it's like that interview that was done with me with the San Jose Mercury, and I hate these interviews, or the ones in Playboy, that Mordecai Richler. She takes a very serious subject, and Charles Spears can show you all the documentation to prove what he says is happening, and we share information, and we work very hard to try to turn this country straight. Then these snotty little writers come along and think they're so cute. And she says, what I don't have to do, I don't have to rely on the National Enquirer. He talks about his theories of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Odessa, and so forth, the National Security Council, the CIA. Well, there's nothing wrong with talking about those things. That's exactly what's coming down. And if she had any guts, she would examine it seriously, take one issue, and if she finds it wrong, then throw out everything else if she wants, but give us one or two wrongs. But these people don't have the nerve to do it. She'll talk about, she made fun of other opinions he had, suggesting murders of Natalie Wood or William Holden, or the SS boys are laughing at Argentina, or Mary Jo Kopechne and Chappaquiddick and William Buckley. All of these people are involved up to their earballs, if not down to their butts. And she, tongue-in-cheek, throws around the name of Alan Dulles and Galen Plans and the Buckley family and Herbert Hoover. Well, there is a connecting link. Time, place, city, bank, it all comes together very nicely, so consistently that she has no right to laugh at them, and she'll make fun of. It's not when somebody calls, are you Mae Brussell the theorist, I say goodbye, because a conspiracy is two or more people doing an illegal act. And when they call you a theorist, just say up yours, goodbye, because there's no time for these negative feelings. And she wants to put down what he's doing and his intelligence and his dedication and his interest in not having World War III. Now, this particular lady can just open her paper and see that Ronald Reagan is ready for Armageddon. If it comes, I'll lead you. Well, what is that? That's not even a war. That's just suicide. And it's like Jonestown. He's getting us ready. He'll lead us to it. So if you want to write to her and tell her that you don't appreciate that, if you have a pen, Dallas Times Herald, Molly Ivens, Ivens. Here's the address, 1101 Pacific, Dallas, Texas, zip code 75202. And you might send a letter out. Charlie Spears suggested, tell her your opinion of the profitless stand, how little he's made off of the subversion. The people that are part of these conspiracies have made a fortune. And the others, just carry on, carry their own, and carry the burden of the lazy people or the people that just refuse to really study the papers every day. And if they don't become believers by next year, then they never had the mentality to believe it anyway, because next year isn't going to be like this year, and last year isn't anything like this year. Now, there was an obituary in the newspaper, the San Jose Mercury. I take a lot of papers, and this goes to the Larry Flynt story. David Emery called me and said, look at your San Jose Mercury. Mitchell WerBell III, soldier of fortune, died. If any of you have my broadcast of the last 3 or 4 weeks, particularly broadcast 624, where I said, how would you like to have these people for dinner? I talked about house guests that moved in on Larry Flynt, Gordon Novell, and Mitchell WerBell, and gave you a little biography of those men. Now, Mitchell WerBell, the news story came out of Powder Springs, Georgia. Sure, he was old. Sure, he drank a lot. They described him as a soldier of fortune, a former international arms dealer, one-time operator of a counter-terrorist training school. Well, his son still operates it. It's still going. He's like Sven Kramer. The apple falls right next to that tree. WerBell's anti-communist activity over the years was linked frequently with the CIA. You better believe it. The silencers and the wiping out of individuals and entire nations. I mean, what chance did Larry Flynt have when you have this kind of guest around you? He served as an agent from the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, and of course he worked with the entire Galen Nazi operation. The World War II forerunner of the CIA. He was in the OSS, he was in the CIA. Most recently, WerBell was a security advisor for Hustler's magazine publisher Larry Flynt. Larry Flynt ended up in a federal hospital, called crazy. He's not crazy. He's been given some drugs that have altered his personality. He wasn't doing these things before WerBell moved in the house, but WerBell is dead. I was talking about him first I was talking about Larry Flynt, and all of a sudden his bad luck, because he's telling the truth, gets him in trouble. WerBell was a drunk. He had a cancer that was in remission. He's a no-good bum, but he still was a wheeler and dealer. And I asked the question, was his last grand act to deliver Larry Flynt to Uncle Sam? Because he was the one who was with Larry Flynt, dressed in a flag instead of saying, don't do it. I mean, this is the great anti-communist I talked about. Puts a purple heart on Larry, and Larry gets a federal rap for it and can't leave or go anywhere and enjoy his own home or his own physical therapy or dietitian. And WerBell goes with him to court, and he got, I think, a $6,000 fine for having his cane or his stick that has a weapon in it. So he's dead. Forget that fine. Doesn't matter anyway. The main thing is that Larry Flynt has to live with all the charges and all the handling. But interesting thing is violent anti-communist, CIA, OSS, moving in when a man is going to become politically radical and write about Larry McDonald and write about the Nazis and the Kennedy assassination. And in fact, there are many people that I've talked about in the air continuously that Mitchell WerBell worked with. One of the programs I did back in 1980, that was 3 years ago, broadcast 441, which some of you might want to get this one if you've become current subscribers. It's about the Kennedy assassination and Curtis Laverne Crawford, who was suggested by the Warren Commission members, one of them of the staff, of being Oswald's double. And the relationship, he worked at a circus where Jack Ruby picked him up, and he worked in the circus in Dallas. Ruby was visiting different people. I think there were handbills he was passing out or accumulating. And I talked about the Internation Circus that comes out of Chicago, Illinois. And the role of Frank Sturgis, his name was on the stationery, and G. Gordon Liddy was mentioned. He's on a friend of Larry Flynt's that moved in. His pictures in the February Hustler. Mitchell WerBell working for that operation. Well, Frank Sturgis is close to Jack Anderson. He's always had a close liaison with Jack Anderson. And Gordon Novell was going between Jack Anderson, John DeLorean, and getting Larry Flynt in trouble in California. And he had no brakes. He let these people in, and that's the Flynt Gate. The locks and doors and the walkie-talkies, the Flynt Gate opened, and in they rushed, and I did a program, and the man who warned us, he sent me a letter, and Charles Spears a letter about Internation Circus. I never followed it up for you. He was murdered shortly after he warned us about this group and the use of the circus for the Defense Department Intelligence Agency. There was another snide remark about Larry Flynt, an interview in the Chicago Tribune. Larry Flynt still hustling publicity and conspiracies. And it tells about his home, his armed fortress behind an iron fence, and the bodyguards everywhere, an army of them on the lawn, in the driveways, tending the cars, limousines, and vans. They're dressed like Secret Service. They tell you this is the story of the security of Larry Flynt. And with that, all these people, these nice people, moved in. So with those kind of friends, you don't need any security. You could let everyone go. If you're going to let those people move in, there's no security in that kind of a place. And he made a lot of mistakes, and he was excited and publishing this stuff, and the doors opened up and they came in. Well, Mitchell WerBell is dead, and that's a shame. Now we're going to begin. It's 1 minute over the half hour, so we're going to go right into the second side of broadcast number 628, December 19th, 1983, because I want to cover a lot on Grenada. That is the biggest story in the news. As I say, Rebel 2 and 3 will go to press without it. I don't care. I'm working every week. I'm turning in the material to Larry Flynt down there where he is. I was in touch with the person who's in charge of him, called yesterday, and I won't send anything more down to Rebel. I'll send it to Larry, and I'll just keep writing. And when he's out, he can have my material, and they're going to print the kind of trash that they did. I got a copy of the Grenada story. I went down to L.A., and I wasn't going to go to the office of Rebel. I told you he called me and said, come down. So this last Tuesday I went, and by then he was in the federal prison at Terminal Island, and I wasn't going. And then he called the Rebel office and said, have Mae come over, and I went over there, and I got a copy of the story in Rebel 2 of the person who replaced my article. Now, there's a conflict of interest there because the decision not to put my story in was made by somebody who works with a person in the East whose story is so bad that I'm going to outline it and do a critique of what they decide to publish, and then outline what I sent there and send it to Larry himself, because he knows my work. He knows the quality of my work, and if I have to deal that way, I'll just not work with them at all, or I'll deal with Larry Flynt. And a lot of people say, be careful and stay away from the whole place. It's dangerous. I'm not opening my door to them, but they know where you are. I'll have to make the decision in a few weeks whether I even want to do it. If Larry goes over their head, that makes them mad. And obviously, there is an intent to put things in there that Mae Brussell isn't going to write, and that isn't why the Rebel was started. He wanted me in there every single week. But I'm so furious at the way the whole thing was handled that, as I say, I wasn't going to go over there, but because he was nice enough, and he's confined, to call there and ask me, I was in town, to go there, I did go to the office, and we'll do more on that now. But I'm not stopping my work on Grenada. I'm working just as hard as I would if I knew him or didn't know him. And I want to give you some of the top stories, because that's a microcosm. Everyone involved with the Grenada operation could be involved with the takeover of America, even at the Olympics, because Mr. Califano, who was head of health, education, and welfare when Sir Eric Gairy was kicked out by Maurice Bishop, was working on the garden plot with Ramsey Clark, who is the attorney for Bernard Cord, who killed Maurice Bishop and was paid by Robert Vesco. They worked with Ronald Reagan when he was governor, And the garden plot is a long, complicated story planned in Atlanta, Georgia for the takeover of America. And there they are down again. He was governor a while back. Now he's the president, and these people are involved in that tiny island. And the care that they've given and the role that they've played is something that we may be getting on our heads with the least excuse of a bomb or a nuclear explosion, sacrifice one city and tie up all of America. Hitler did it in Germany. They bombed the Reichstag. They took a building, just like they bombed the Capitol, and that was the end of all the liberties. He was elected in every city, every jail, every newspaper, every college, every professor, every hospital, every decision of every person's life in Germany was made because a man had set off a bomb on the Reichstag that later was proven to be a provocateur, just like a few Germans dressed in Polish uniforms and came across the border towards Germany, and it opened up a war that cost the Russians 20 million, that cost the world in general 80 million dead or displaced. So that one act, your life, your security, your savings, your banks, they collected banks, they took people out of homes, they shipped them out of places. The invasion of Grenada, where they said every Cuban had to leave the island, computers are set up. The police state tactics have to be more than for 100,000 native population. Now, some of the highlight stories that have come up since I did Grenada story 2 weeks ago. London Observer, Sir Eric Gairy's return adds to the island's fears. It's about the abrupt departure of Mr. Rushford, Tony Rushford, who was supposed to stay in control in the government. He left, and the impending arrival of Sir Eric Gairy. He was a maitre d' of a nightclub, and I had that on the air and in the article, a maitre d' who worked his way up a goon squad, who collected items of Mr. Pinochet, who helped make his army, who was close to the Friends of South Korea. He has an academic gown worn at a South Korean university. Grenadians remember him at the United Nations with a commission to study flying saucers, which is the least of what he did. But he was a vicious man who worked with, he said he had animal skulls around them he used for animal practice and so forth and so on. Now, they're afraid of Gary's return. They're afraid of it. That's what America's leaving. Sir Eric Gairy coming back to the island. He's the one that goes to the United Nations to Peter Bourne, who worked for Jimmy Carter, says, get Carter to help me. They go to Mr. Califano, who worked with the Bay of Pigs. I talked about that, and the CIA assassination teams. And then Mr. Henry Kissinger and Lord Peter Carrington from London set up in Barbados the wheels to kill Bishop. Now it's a few years later, and Mr. Eric Gairy is coming back. Another story out of the Chicago Tribune and the Houston Post. It's like a bad dream. It's a story of Ann Bishop, Maurice Bishop's sister. And she tells how her father was gunned down in the streets and was a national martyr. My brother was gunned down. And she said, I visited my brother 2 days before he was killed, and he said, I'm going to kill me. He's good. After my father, I was always worried that they would kill me. I thought it would be mercenaries or the CIA, frankly. I never thought it would be best friends of his, people he practically lived with. And they talk about her brother's executioner and somebody like Bernard Cord. Well, everybody has a price, and NBC News had the story, and I'll repeat the exact date, how Bernard Cord was paid by Robert Vesco, and how Vesco, the resorts will come back there, Vesco will have a place for dope dealing, and his best friend betrayed him. That's why it's dangerous working down in L.A. a little bit, and I wonder, and I'll tell you, people are afraid because even if you have a friend who stands by you that will publish what you print, if the people who get it out don't want you, even your friends can't help you, and particularly when your friends are in trouble. They can be bent, so there's a dangerous situation, and I have to be aware of that. Another story of New Solidarity. Will the chief appeaser, Mr. Peter Carrington, Lord Peter Carrington, head NATO? And this goes into the not only the Henry Kissinger-Carrington Association that Representative Henry Gonzalez eloquently spoke about exactly 1 month the day before the invasion, where he talks about Kissinger being a hired gun. Incidentally, Charles Spears said he's sending Henry Gonzalez the transcripts of these tapes. So I want to officially thank you. You can get the back broadcasts. I'll send them to you. You are a hero to speak about the State Department being leased to Kissinger and Carrington Associates. Now, this article goes into the Kissinger-Carrington links to narcotics in the Golden Crescent, not in Southeast Asia, in the Afghan-Pakistan connection in the Middle East. And also it says Carrington has been linked to a sex scandal breaking in Britain involving the procurement of young boys and sexual abuse by diplomats. Many of you have read that they're changing the staff at Buckingham Palace and the use of these little boys. It says on November 24th, a member of Parliament, Geoffrey Dickens, a member of the Tory faction, opposed to Carrington's policies and revealed a dossier containing evidence of a pedophile ring of which he operated for years out of Buckingham Palace and the Foreign Office, the office Carrington headed. The pedophilia scandal involves Carrington's close associate, former Home Secretary William Whitelaw, and as yet unnamed members of the Foreign Service. They have an organization called PIE, P-I-E, Pederasty Information Exchange, which provides young boys to diplomats with Henry Kissinger's reputed proclivities. Now, this is about Kissinger-Carrington. Is he going to be the head of NATO? Then Wall Street Journal has a story, December the 12th. New NATO chief irks the hardliners. Lord Carrington is too soft. They want they think he is appeasing the Soviet Union, and he may favor the Soviet Union as against the Atlantic Alliance. The Atlantic Alliance is critical because he is breaking up with NATO. He would break up the relationship and encouragement of the NATO countries that got along, and he wants a stronger European interest within NATO working with each other. Now, that's exactly what Adolf Hitler had in his plans, and if Henry Kissinger is a Nazi, break America against Great Britain. And the article in the Wall Street Journal says that a lot of people are worried about what Carrington will do, but it seems that what Carrington's doing is exactly what Adolf Hitler dreamed of with the help of Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. New Solidarity has an editorial, Stop the Carrington Coup. The Carrington policy is dangerous, and it goes into the Queen and Lord Peter and Henry the K's policies, and it said they're not exactly a secret in the military and intelligence communities anymore. There's a lot being written if you want to see it. Another story about Grenada, Army hails the new helmets' value in Grenada. And it tells about the new helmets that were used down there. They're called the Kevlar, K-E-V-L-A-R. They look like those worn by the Nazi soldiers in World War II. They gradually will replace the steel pot that the American servicemen wore. Somebody called up, I believe, on the talk show part of the program and asked if I noticed a similarity between the helmets, the German Nazi helmets, and the Americans that were wearing them down in Grenada. This is New York Times picked that up. Another story out of the People's World. U.S. corporations are taking their aim at Grenada. It said, whatever else is said about the U.S. invasion of Grenada, one fact is clear. American businessmen are happy. A Texas businessman, Ron Adams, talked about having a jewelry factory in the Caribbean. The White House called in a group of businessmen to start in Grenada, and this article refers to the biggest, this is a quote, the biggest enticement, according to Newsweek, November 14, 1983, is a pool of unskilled yet trainable labor willing to work for subsistence wages as low as 20 cents to $1 an hour. Now, what you get rid of people like Maurice Bishop or Salvador Allende or John Kennedy or a lot of other heads of states for three reasons. One, to escalate the munitions you make and the ammunition. The other is to deal the dope. And third is to control the labor. Well, the fourth is the minerals, and you can go to the banking. Control of people. You see, by putting American investment down in Grenada now and being sure it isn't taken away like Castro took away the Hilton Hotel and made a hospital out of it in Cuba, heavens forbid, what they want now is to send the businesses there because Americans are making too much an hour. You may make $4 or $5 an hour. If they could, they'd put McDonald's hamburgers down there and have the new rockets that propel the sandwiches and maybe use slave labor, and we'll have satellite hamburgers that'll be delivered in 20 minutes from another planet, and they'll work for nothing like they did in Dora and the Punamund and the Nazi factories for nothing. So Newsweek is encouraging building, and they refer to an island, St. Kitts, down in the Caribbean, one of the islands involved in the invasion of Grenada, and wages are $30 to $60 a week compared to $350 or $400 in the United States. That's in Newsweek. The transducer systems, a Pennsylvania manufacturer, can save 90% of its cost. Well, you may say that makes the item cheaper for you to buy in the United States, but the truth is that when you have unemployment in the United States, you pay for the police, the jails. The 28,000 people in California jails are costing $10,000 a year. They send each one to Harvard. So you have to pay for the medication. If you have a surgery, it's $20,000. Person doesn't have money. The state pays for it. A friend just had surgery, colon removed, $28,000. The state pays for it. So if you send all the industry out and people don't have money to work in this country, then you've got to pay for their needs anyway. So it isn't cheap. What you think you get is cheap isn't cheap, and we shouldn't allow this slave labor. We talk about slave labor over the Soviet Union, and we shouldn't buy parts from Russia because they use slave labor. Notice how they're advertising in U.S. News or Newsweek about it. Another story for the Washington Post. Grenada scene ripe for private investors. The White House has called them in to interest the U.S. executives into buying into Grenada businesses. The White House had 125 business leaders and government officials, and they told these leaders that if they start a deal, a profitable deal can be struck for both sides using credit and technology from America and products and labor in Grenada that generate employment and income for them. Take the employment out of the United States, reap your biggest profit, make an estate for yourself. Employment and income for them means they earn money and they have an income, but it'll be $100 a month, and that's all. Well, we're not replacing the schools or the Cubans who are giving them medical care or helping them with their own needs of literacy or illiteracy or teaching them. So it's totally obscene that they planned this invasion from 1979 when Bishop came in, and Sir Eric Gairy with the Mongoose Squad can come down there, and now the president even invites the business people. Come on now, show it how it is. Another story out of the Washington Post, the island tussles over the legacy of Maurice Bishop. They don't know what to do. The first stories were everybody wanted the invasion. Oh, it's wonderful. We're so glad to have you. America is so great. Now they've got to stick with Orlando Letelier's murder in Washington, or Karen Silkwood in the United States waiting for Kerr McGee, or Salvador Allende, or Martin Luther King Day, and John Kennedy Airport, and John Kennedy. They got to have the Maurice Bishop specter because the unanswered questions over the island. And they said at stake is more than one man's place in history. What can they do? It's a question of preventing the affection for the fallen leader, that people won't embrace a revolution again. It's like killing Mr. Aquino and having demonstrations and turning. So he wasn't so disliked. He wasn't unloved. They appreciate him. So they've got a problem, how much aid they should give, how much money. What do the people think? What do they feel? And we don't know what they feel, and we don't know if we'll ever be welcome or everyone will hate us around the world. Maybe the election in Japan is an inkling of what people are feeling. Another story out of the Washington Times, Grenada, on what the media would have done. And it says a survey was taken and Americans rallied behind the support of the president in not allowing the news media. Of course they did. This paper is published by Reverend Moon. And then it quotes John Chancellor, who gave a speech, and it was published in the New York Times November 15th. And Chancellor was opposing the media being held back from seeing what was going on that was so necessary for a population of 100,000, that no news people there were 5 days. Mr. Chancellor, this is a quote, said, "A free society is defined in part by the freedom of its press, and though it is imperfect, contradictory, and inefficient, it is infinitely preferable to a flow of information which comes solely from the government." He said, in banning the press, the Reagan administration's dubious accomplishment was to keep the deaths off the television, decreasing their visual impact on the American public and reducing the death to statistics. He was arguing the Americans have a right to see the horror of war. Now, he was saying that Reagan didn't want the deaths to be seen. But what happened? The day that they invaded, They circled with helicopters for several hours, and the heads, Mr. Cord and the head of the Mr. Austin of the Army, were at the medical school with Jeffrey Bourne. They were on the telephone with Robert Pastor, formerly of the National Security Council, who covered up the bodies and deaths at Jonestown, taking the tags off. They're in touch with Mr. Monica, the Republican lawyer, and they're circling, and Mr. Austin and Cord are in touch with the mental hospital and the medical school. And then over the 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Cord or Austin has come by and said, lock up the bodies and come out of there so that the caretakers are gone. I haven't read one interview of a doctor of a mental hospital for 180 people. Bang, bombs, 4 bombs right on the medical hospital. And as I said before, and head on the air and put in that article I did on Grenada that will be published by Larry when he gets out, in total, that was their target. Now, John Chancellor is saying we have a right to see it, and the reason we didn't want to see it is that I believe they had to wipe out the mental hospital. He's saying they're concealing the deaths. They have to keep the deaths off television. You better believe when you go to a country and whammo a mental hospital at 2 in the afternoon and don't let anyone in for 5 days, and you can't account for all those. There's 180 and 50 at first were dead, and there's a stockpile of bodies, 100 bodies, then 200, and then none. And they can't find Bishop's body, and there were stories they were fed to the sharks out at sea. You better believe war is bad. I'd rather see them killed if we're going to kill them than be told we didn't kill them, and then another country says we killed them, and we don't know how many or how they died. The press should have been there. Yes, indeed, they should have been there. Another story, Grenada documents spur questions. This is Houston Post again. I have a friend in Houston that mails me these marvelous articles that I'm not getting in any other paper. Incidentally, that Mitchell WerBell obituary, I talked to Ted Rubenstein down in L.A. He didn't know about WerBell being dead. It wasn't in the Chronicle. It wasn't in the Monterey Herald. It wasn't in the major papers. I haven't seen the L.A. Times. It'd be interesting to see how long it takes for the obituary of a man who's written up in so many books about weapons and the Cold War, the Hot Wars, Mitchell WerBell. I wonder what major newspaper outside the San Jose Mercury is going to carry it along with that San Jose Mercury story. But this story is a Grenada document spur questions, and it tells about fascinating hours that Georgie and Gairy spent looking over secret papers left behind. Now, some secret papers, again, are like the Lee Harvey Oswald diary, E. Howard Hunt being called by the CIA or Charles Colson, get to Artie Bremer's apartment in Milwaukee. The door is open. You get planted diaries. Gerald Ford was part of the Oswald planted diary story. Never verified that he wrote it or saw it. When you get these secret papers that the newspaper people just handed, like the list of the SLA to Marilyn Baker, who turned out working for the police and the FBI, she has these secret papers, and one links a correspondence with Representative Donald Dellums in California, and another one with a Christian organization that they were interested down there. I didn't know Marxists were interested in Christians, the National Council of Churches. If they're so Marxist, why involvement with the Marxists and the National Council of Churches? But then it goes in, there's a letter in the documents that she says, among them a letter that Maurice Bishop wrote that it quotes, he was encouraged by William Clark's response that they're willing to accept talks on the normalization of relations. And what I wrote was that Maurice Bishop went to Washington in June. He saw William Clark, asked him to help him. He didn't go to the Soviet Union. He walked out of the office. William Clark picks up the telephone and then is the man responsible for putting Henry Kissinger on the Central American Committee, and Carrington is the responsible for Barbados, Kissinger's partner, for the overthrow of the country. What they do is sprinkle the letters as the excuse that Mr. Cord or Austin will think that he's selling out to the Americans and create the excuse for his murder. She says that maybe this is probably what got Bishop murdered by the hardline Marxists around him after reading those papers. Well, I don't know if Bernard Cord is a hardline Marxist. If he's paid $45,000 by Robert Vesco, I doubt if that is a hardline Marxist. That's pure capital cash. The cover stories that the Marxists didn't like Bishop because he was selling out to Clark are ridiculous. He went to see William Clark. William Clark calls Kissinger, says, Kissinger, I want you to be on the Committee of Central America. As a matter of fact, I think that's in Congressman Gonzalez's report, the pecking order, how Clark put Kissinger into the Central American Committee. So another story this week, another Reagan aide quits. David Gergen, director of the White House Communications, he's going to accept a residency at Harvard University. I heard him on the radio and Channel 3 CNN this week. Gergen is a veteran of the last 3 Republican administrations. He's leaving the White House. He's unhappy. He's not happy with such areas as press control in the invasion of Grenada or the use of polygraph or lie detector tests on the administration's staff. The tests were because of the National Security Council meetings where the United States was going to go whammo in the Middle East and go into Lebanon, and that also may have picked up the planned invasions that were documented in the Washington Post that were going to take. They were talking about entering Grenada at the time of the World Series, I mentioned it, and these preceded by several days when Maurice Bishop was even murdered or when there was any martial law. Now, why would a man who works for 3 administrations, who works for the President of the United States, leave because of the press at the time? This is an island of 100,000. The people are supposed to be in danger. We know they're not. And he leaves and he cites the press coverage. And the press should have been there, and they should have seen the bombing of the hospital and the medical school and see what was going on. Another story, the United States says that Grenada planned a big army. This is the San Francisco Chronicle. Well, it was obvious they needed an army. You saw how they were invaded. Wouldn't you need an army? I mean, is there anything wrong with that? And then it tells that among other documents they found there about the legible notes handwritten by an unidentified author, of course. He described the deliberations of Maurice Bishop's group, the New Jewel leaders, just before the invasion. The notes involved discussions explaining the overthrow of Bishop by charging him with fostering a cult of personality, mollifying Cuban anger at Bishop's death, and waiting with stole resignation for the U.S. invasion, the notes say, of the United States. Now that's interesting because, again, these notes explain that they sat stoically waiting for the U.S. invasion, and Mr. Austin and Bernard Cord, the best friends allegedly or close associates of Maurice Bishop, had him killed. Now Cord is getting $45,000 from Robert Vesco, and if the airstrip was put in by Robert Vesco, this was on NBC News, and he built a big hunk of that, then were Austin and Cord under a kind of mind control with Dr. Peter Bourne, their associates, and Jeffrey Bourne running the school, the medical school on the island, the excuse for the invasion. The school was the excuse, the airport runway was the excuse, was a danger to South America, and the Barbados and Dominica particularly requesting them to come in when this operation was set up by Kissinger and Carrington. All of the excuses for the invasion had direct links to the Defense Department, the National Security Agency, and the CIA. But you have a mental hospital that Mr. Austin was at the day it was bombed and stopped by, telephoned them and stopped by and knew what was happening. He's sitting with Dr. Jeffrey Bourne, who ran the Yerkes, Yerkes, Mind Control Experimentation Center in Atlanta, Georgia, right very close to Jimmy Carter at the university. They're all mind experiments. Why couldn't Cord and Austin be victims of mind experiments themselves at a time when you're getting ready for Sir Eric Gairy and the mafia to take over the island again? Vesco and Sir Eric Gairy and their links to down to South Korea and to Haiti and to Pinochet, Chile, and all the other dictatorships. Isn't it strange that they're sitting there waiting for a U.S. invasion? Now they're in jail. I wonder if they'll get off like Dan White. I don't know. But they're sitting there. Are they nervous? I don't know. Now, New Solidarity had a wonderful article, November 27th, 10 tough questions to ask Walter Mondale. And as crazy as they are in some things, they're great in other research. And I mentioned in my article these little monkeys that Dr. Delgado or Jeffrey Bourne, Dr. Bourne, could work on. But the hysterical thing when I got the article was a picture of this great big orangutan. They have a picture of Mondale because he works with Robert Pastor, Peter Bourne, and Jim Jones, and the hostages. And it's a very good article with 10 questions they ask, and it says Jimmy Carter's head doctors were trained at the Yerkes primate lab. Shown here a patient. Yerkes Jeffrey Bourne ran the medical school in Grenada. And you have this gross, great big head of this orangutan, not the little tiny monkey that I pictured. And there's questions. Why was Robert Pastor, formerly Jimmy Carter's White House expert on Latin America and a top foreign policy advisor to Mondale, also working with General Hudson Austin and Bernard Cord down in Grenada at the time of the invasion? I don't have time for the 10 questions. The program is over. I have a half a minute. That's all I got, a half a minute. I have more on Bernard Cord and Ramsey Clark becoming the attorney for Bernard Cord, and the role of Robert Vesco also in the James Earl Ray cover-up, the murder of Martin Luther King. We'll do more next week. There's so much. We have to go to the interconnecting links of Vesco to the Martin Luther King assassination, because Ramsey Clark was the Attorney General at the time, and he now wants to represent Bernard Cord. But I see that it's time for the blues here on KAZU, so I'm going to sign off right this minute. It's Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.